I'm going to open this one by admitting something a little embarrassing. I'm kind of sick of Drow. There, I said it. Send the pitchforks. It's not that I hate them. It's that if you've been anywhere near a fantasy setting in the last 30 years, you've met a version of them so many times that meeting a new one feels like getting reintroduced to your co-worker's cousin for the 5th Thanksgiving in a row. Dark skin, white hair, lives underground, worships a spider goddess who's mean to everyone, including her own priestesses, probably has a scowl surgically attached to their face. You know the type. But here's the thing that actually got me writing this video instead of just complaining about it on a Discord server at 2 in the morning. The Drow, in spite of being so overused, they've practically become fantasy wallpaper, have a genuinely strange and kind of upsetting history buried under all that goth elf posturing. So let's dig through the matriarchal murder pit and see what's actually down there. First, the obvious question, why are there so many of these guys? Drow, dark elves, whatever your setting calls them, show up in nearly every fantasy universe that's ever existed, to the point that if a fantasy world doesn't have some flavor of evil subterranean elf, I start to get suspicious the author forgot to include one. Tolkien gets some blame here, sort of, since the idea of a corrupted branch of a beautiful race digging underground and turning nasty traces back to how he handled certain elves who wandered from the light. But D&D took that seed and ran a marathon with it, and everyone else copied D&D's homework so thoroughly that at this point the Drow aren't really Tolkien's fault anymore. They're just a genre convention, like the Chosen One or the wise old mentor who dies in Act 2. So with that context established, let's actually look at how D&D specifically built these guys, because the lore is weirder and pettier than you'd expect. Once upon a time, and I do mean once upon a time because we're talking creation myth levels of ancient here, all elves were one people. Living under the goddess Corellon Larethian, elves were united, mostly happy, mostly pointy-eared, mostly insufferable in the way elves in fantasy tend to be. Then along came Lolth. Now, depending on which edition or which sourcebook you're reading, Lolth's backstory shifts around like she's been caught lying to a court and keeps changing her testimony, but the through line is this. Lolth was some flavor of spider deity, sometimes said to be a demon who wormed her way into godhood, sometimes an elven goddess who fell from grace, and she wanted power. She stirred up dissent among the elves, whispered temptations, played factions against each other, generally did what any self-respecting evil goddess does at a dinner party. Eventually, this boiled over into outright war. Some elves sided with her, most didn't. Corellon, not exactly known for his patience with betrayal, cursed the elves who'd sided with Lolth, twisting their skin dark and banishing them from the surface world entirely. And just like that, dark elves. Now here's the part that I think doesn't get talked about enough, and it's the part that makes the Drow more interesting than the average evil race. The banishment wasn't really Corellon punishing them for being evil. It was Corellon punishing them for choosing the wrong side of a political and religious civil war. Which means when you actually sit with it, the entire premise of the Drow's existence is refugees who got permanently exiled underground because they backed the losing team in what was essentially a heavenly election. That's not really a race that's evil to the bone. That's a race that got stuck living in the world's worst timeout corner for several thousand years and slowly built a society around spite, survival, and a goddess who, by the way, still treats them like garbage. Because let's talk about Lolth, since she deserves the spotlight here more than any individual Drow city does. Lolth is, and I cannot stress this enough, an absolute nightmare of a patron deity. She's got the whole spider motif going, obviously. Web spinning, poison, the 8 legs, all of it. But the actual personality behind the iconography is somehow worse than the aesthetic implies. She demands worship through cruelty. She rewards betrayal. She actively encourages her priestesses to backstab, poison, and murder each other because in her worldview, only the strong deserve to keep breathing, and the best way to prove you're strong is to demonstrate you can kill someone who trusted you. It's less a religion and more a permanent hazing ritual that never ends because there's no graduating class, just an eternal freshman year of stabbing. This bleeds into Drow society at basically every level, and it's honestly the most consistently interesting part of the whole race. Drow cities, most famously Menzoberranzan, which I'm not even going to pretend I can spell correctly on the first try every single time, are matriarchal to an extreme degree. Noble houses, run by high priestesses of Lolth, compete constantly for status, and that competition isn't the polite kind where you write a strongly worded letter to the city council. It's assassination, sabotage, and the occasional full-scale magical civil war between houses that ends with entire bloodlines wiped out overnight. And this is treated as normal. This is Tuesday. A given noble house might spend decades slowly climbing the social ladder only to get wiped off the map because a rival house's priestess had a good dream about spiders one night and took it as a sign from Lolth that murder was on the agenda. Males in Drow society, by comparison, get the short end of a very long, very venomous stick. They can hold power, technically. They can become skilled fighters or even wizards, since Drow society does still value magic and martial skill, but they're perpetually second-class citizens in a culture run by priestesses who view them as tools first and people a distant second. A talented male Drow might rise to command a house's military forces, might even become genuinely influential, but the moment he outlives his usefulness or threatens to overshadow the women actually running things, well, Lolth's altar is right there, and it's hungry. Now, I do want to give credit where it's due, because it would be lazy of me to just say, Drow bad, Drow murder each other, the end. There's an actual internal logic here that I find compelling once you dig past the shock value. Drow society isn't chaotic in the sense of being random. It's rigidly hierarchical, obsessed with etiquette, obsessed with proper conduct, obsessed with knowing exactly where you stand relative to everyone around you at all times. The murder and backstabbing isn't lawless chaos. It's a brutal but consistent set of rules everyone silently agrees to follow. You can absolutely kill a rival to advance, but you'd better do it cleverly, you'd better cover your tracks, and you'd better not get caught doing it against someone more powerful than you, because then it's not political maneuvering anymore. It's just suicide with extra steps. It's lawful evil dressed up as anarchy, and once you see that structure, Drow society stops reading like edgy nonsense and starts reading like the world's most poisonous corporate ladder. Let's talk about the actual city of Menzoberranzan for a bit, since it's the poster child for Drow settlements and honestly deserves the reputation. Built into a massive cavern in the Underdark, it's home to tens of thousands of Drow packed into a hierarchy of noble houses, all jockeying for the top 8 positions on what's called the ruling council. Getting onto that council isn't an election, it's a body count. Houses claw their way up by systematically weakening or outright destroying whichever house currently occupies the seat they want, and the city as a whole operates under a fragile agreement that, yes, everyone is constantly trying to murder each other for status, but there are lines you don't cross, mainly involving not blowing up the entire cavern in the process, since even the most ambitious priestess would rather have a city to rule than a smoking crater. The architecture itself is worth a mention too, because it says a lot about Drow priorities. Buildings in Menzoberranzan are grown and shaped using magic into these looming, organic, almost fungal-looking spires, all sharp angles and unsettling curves, less like a city built by hand and more like something that metastasized out of the rock. It's beautiful in the way a well-lit crime scene is beautiful, which feels appropriate. Now let's talk weapons and tools, because Drow have some genuinely cool bits of iconography buried under all the murder. Piwafwi cloaks, which yes, is a real word I did not make up, are enchanted garments that help Drow blend into shadow, letting them move through the Underdark or infiltrate the surface without being spotted easily. Hand crossbows loaded with poison are a classic Drow signature, the kind of weapon that says, "I don't want to fight you. I want you unconscious and helpless before you even realize combat has started," which is very on brand for a culture built entirely around backstabbing efficiently. And then there's Drow adamantine and Drow steel, weapons and armor forged in ways that make them lightweight and lethal, though famously with a catch that's become something of a running joke among players. A lot of Drow-crafted gear degrades or straight-up disintegrates when exposed to sunlight for too long, which is deeply, almost comedically fitting. Even their equipment can't survive contact with the surface world without falling apart, same as the culture that made it. Let's also touch on the Drow pantheon beyond Lolth, because she's not literally the only game in town, even if she acts like it. There are other Drow deities, gods of magic, gods of war, gods who represent the faint possibility of Drow choosing a life that isn't built entirely around spider-based terror. But here's the thing. Lolth's church actively suppresses worship of these other gods, sometimes violently, because Lolth does not do well with competition, shocking absolutely no one. Which means most Drow who might privately prefer literally any other deity keep that preference extremely quiet, because publicly worshipping the wrong god in a Lolth-dominated city is a great way to get volunteered for a very short career as a sacrifice. This is actually where some of the more compelling Drow stories come from, and I think it's worth pausing on because it's the part that keeps this race from being pure one-note evil. Every so often you get Drow who reject Lolth's philosophy entirely. The most famous example, and I'm sure you already know where I'm going with this because it's basically impossible to talk about Drow without eventually bumping into him, is a certain ranger who left the Underdark, took his cat with him, and became one of the most beloved characters in the entire genre, despite technically belonging to a species most people assume is irredeemable on sight. And look, I know bringing him up is basically required by law at this point in any Drow discussion, but it does illustrate something real about the lore. The Drow aren't evil because of some biological curse baked into their blood. They're evil because their entire society, religion, and power structure is built specifically to reward cruelty and punish compassion, which means individuals who somehow claw their way to a different moral framework in spite of an entire culture actively working against that outcome become genuinely compelling precisely because it was so hard for them to get there. There are whole enclaves of these surface-sympathetic or Lolth-rejecting Drow scattered around various settings, small pockets of people trying to build something that isn't founded on ritual betrayal, and they tend to live extremely precarious lives because their old society considers them traitors worth hunting, and the surface world considers them suspicious at best, actively hostile at worst, because, hey, most surface dwellers have met exactly one type of Drow story before, and it usually ends with someone's throat being opened by a poisoned crossbow bolt. Let's shift gears and talk about Drow magic for a second, because it's genuinely one of the cooler parts of the race that gets slightly buried under all the political murder. Drow have an inherent connection to shadow and darkness, some innate spellcasting tied to that, things like conjuring magical darkness or brief invisibility, gifts from a heritage soaked in centuries of underground living, and Lolth's own dominion over the dark. It's subtle stuff mostly, not the flashiest magic in the game, but thematically perfect, since it reinforces this idea of Drow as people who are fundamentally more comfortable manipulating shadow, secrecy, and the unseen than they ever were comfortable in open sunlight, literally and metaphorically. Priestesses, meanwhile, wield genuinely terrifying divine magic granted directly by Lolth, and the flavor of that magic leans hard into control, poison, and manipulation, spells that dominate minds, summon spiders, or straight up melt someone from the inside out. It's magic that feels less like a blessing and more like a leash, which, again, extremely fitting for a goddess whose entire relationship with her followers can be summed up as obey or die, and also sometimes obey and still die, just to keep you on your toes. Now, Drow don't operate entirely alone down in the Underdark. Spiders, obviously, are a huge part of the aesthetic and the actual ecology, giant spiders bred and trained as guardians, mounts, and weapons, treated with something close to reverence given their association with Lolth. But there's also a fun, less talked about relationship Drow have with certain other Underdark denizens, sometimes trading with Duergar or Mind Flayers when it's mutually beneficial, sometimes going to absolute war with them the moment that benefit dries up, because in the Underdark everyone is one bad negotiation away from becoming someone else's dinner or someone else's slave, and Drow, brutal as they are, understand that reality better than almost anyone else down there. I do want to take a second to acknowledge something that's been part of the broader conversation around Drow for a while now, because I'd be doing a disservice pretending it doesn't exist. There's been legitimate criticism over the years about the visual coding of the Drow, dark-skinned people framed as an inherently corrupted, villainous offshoot of a lighter-skinned, pure race, and how that maps uncomfortably onto some ugly real-world patterns. Wizards of the Coast has actually acknowledged this in recent years and made moves to walk back the idea that Drow are irredeemably evil by default, leaning harder into the idea that individual Drow and even entire communities of Drow can and do choose different paths, same as any other people shaped by circumstance rather than destiny. I think that's a good adjustment, honestly, and it lines up with what I said earlier about their society being a product of trauma, exile, and a genuinely terrible goddess rather than some cosmic evil switch flipped at birth. Let's wrap up the lore portion with a quick word on the Drow's relationship to the surface, since it colors basically every interaction anyone has with them. Surface dwellers mostly know Drow through the lens of raids, kidnappings, and the occasional horror story about an entire town vanishing overnight into the Underdark, never to be seen again except as slaves in some noble house's mining operation. This has understandably left most surface cultures with a knee-jerk assume the worst reaction toward any Drow they encounter, which, again, does make life extra difficult for the rare Drow actually trying to build a different kind of life up there. It's a vicious cycle. Drow raid because their society demands strength and resources. Surface dwellers fear and reject Drow because of the raiding. Any Drow trying to break that cycle gets treated with the same hostility as the raiders, which pushes some of them right back toward the society that at least, however horribly, accepts them. All right, let's talk about actually running Drow at your table, because I think this is a race that's genuinely rewarding to use well and genuinely boring to use lazily. The lazy version, the one you've probably already run into 100 times, is Drow as generic evil elf mooks, dark-skinned bad guys in a cave who exist purely to get murdered by your party on the way to the real quest. And look, sometimes that's fine. Sometimes you just need disposable combat encounters, and Drow scratch that itch as well as goblins do. But if you actually want your table to remember the Drow segment of your campaign, lean into the politics. Let your players get tangled in a noble house power struggle where every NPC they talk to is simultaneously being polite and calculating exactly how useful or threatening the party is to their personal advancement. Make betrayal a constant looming possibility rather than a twist you save for the finale. A Drow ally who seems genuinely helpful should always carry a flicker of, does she actually like us, or are we just currently useful? Because that uncertainty is the entire flavor of the culture. Consider running a Lolth-worshipping house against a house quietly, dangerously flirting with worship of a different god, and let your party get caught in the crossfire of that theological Cold War. Or go the other direction entirely and give your players a Drow companion or ally who's trying to escape that whole system, someone whose entire arc is about proving that where you're from doesn't have to dictate who you become, and then let other NPCs, both Drow and surface dwellers alike, constantly test that premise by treating them with suspicion regardless of how many times they prove themselves. That kind of tension writes itself once you understand the underlying culture, and it's a hell of a lot more interesting than another cave full of poisoned crossbow bolts, even though, don't get me wrong, you should absolutely still have some of those too, because hand crossbows loaded with poison ambushing your party from total darkness never really goes out of style. And that's the Drow. Overused, sure, practically wallpaper in half the fantasy settings you'll ever touch, but underneath the goth aesthetic and the spider goddess and the poisoned bolts is a genuinely tragic setup about a people exiled for picking the wrong side of a war, trapped for millennia under a deity who treats loyalty as a resource to be spent rather than a virtue to be rewarded, and forced to build an entire civilization on the principle that trust is a weakness you can't afford. It's not that Drow are boring, it's that most of the time we only ever get shown the least interesting version of them. As always, if you wouldn't mind, liking, commenting, and subscribing is greatly appreciated. And if not, still, thank you for watching. Take care out there, and have a good one.